How to answer advanced level economics questions on labor market. This lesson covers what you need to know to answer questions on wage determination in a perfectly competitive labor market, wage determination in an imperfect labor market, wage differentials, economic rent and transfer earnings, maximum wage. Discussing, evaluating or assessing the effects of trade union on wage rate and unemployment in a perfectly competitive labor market. You have to consider the two sides. For example, how it increases unemployment and how it reduces unemployment, and then conclude. Do not forget the first paragraph, introduction, where you show your knowledge by defining key terms and stating key features. This is the diagram showing the effects of a trade union succeeding in bargaining for a higher wage rate for its members in a perfectly competitive labor market. The wage rate, WT, is above the equilibrium wage rate, WE. Quantity of labor employed, however, falls to QT from QE, causing a rise in unemployment. Why do firms cut jobs when the wage rate increases? Labor cost or cost of production increases, making businesses to reduce the number of workers employed. Labor is now more expensive than capital, and machines are used to replace workers. This depends on whether labor can easily be substituted by capital. If demand for labor is elastic, a rise in wage rate leads to a bigger fall in the quantity of workers employed. The quantity employed falls by a smaller percentage if demand for labor is fairly inelastic. The elasticity of supply is also important. The less elastic labor supply is, the more difficult it is to get people to fill vacancies. Now, on the other side, we have to look at the factors that will not cause the quantity of labor to fall as opposed to what the diagram says. For a discuss or evaluate question, this has to be considered. Firms may not cut jobs and unemployment will not rise for the following reasons. If productivity, as measured by the marginal revenue product of labor, rises due to a higher wage, the firm will employ more workers and not cut jobs. This is because a rise in wages motivates workers. Also, if training is given, the workers become more skillful and productive, justifying their employment. Labor may be cheaper or cannot be easily replaced with machines. Demand for labor increases if the demand for the product is rising. Firms may not cut jobs if workers are difficult to replace, because they have special skills. Also, if the industry requires the use of more labor than machines, more workers will be employed. Discussing, evaluating or assessing the effects of trade union on wage rate and unemployment in an imperfect labor market. The two sides to be considered are how it increases unemployment and how it reduces unemployment. Trade union in a monopsony labor market. A monopsony firm is a dominant employer of labor that can pay lower wage rate than what is obtainable in a competitive labor market. In the diagram, the firm pays wage W2, which is less than what the worker is worth, W1. The trade union will negotiate a higher wage, WT. More workers are employed, QT, instead of Q1. Why is the monopsony firm not cutting jobs in this market? A higher wage improves productivity, MRP, and increases the demand for labor. Rising demand for the product would increase demand for labor. Workers have special skills and are difficult to replace. Why firms may cut jobs in a monopsony. High labor cost may lead to business closure. Labor can be easily substituted with capital in the industry. More machines are required than labor in the industry. Demand for the product falls. Effects of a minimum wage on wage rate and unemployment in perfectly competitive and imperfect labor market. The effects are the same as those of trade unions. Similar diagrams are used, except that any mention of trade union is changed to minimum wage. Causes of wage differentials. Causes of wage differentials or wage inequalities. Forces of demand and supply. Wage is high if demand for labor exceeds the supply of labor. Workers in trade unions earn higher than non-unionized workers. Education and training and discrimination also cause wage differences. Skills improve productivity as measured by the marginal revenue product. Hours of work matter. Part-time workers earn less than full-time workers. Wage differentials between markets. Discussing why wages in a perfectly competitive labor market will always be higher than wages in a monopsony labor market. From the theory, monopsony firm can pay lower than a competitive market. It has market power. But it may have to pay higher if exploitation causes minimum wage to be introduced. Trade union may negotiate a higher wage than what is paid in a perfectly competitive labor market. It may not be easy to substitute labor with capital. Other factors that can make a monopsony firm to pay more than a perfectly competitive labor market include existing proportion of capital to labor in the particular industry. For a labor-intensive industry like construction, more workers may be needed, making the firm to offer a higher wage to attract them. Higher wage causes a rise in the supply of labor and may be unsustainable in perfectly competitive labor market, hence a higher pay in a monopsony. Next, we will consider wage differentials. Why wage rate inequalities are inevitable and justifiable. Why wage rate inequalities are inevitable. There are many factors responsible for wage rate inequalities. The following are the ones that make wage rate inequalities unavoidable. The imbalance between the demand for labor and supply of labor can cause regional differences in wages. Wage rate tends to be higher where demand for labor is more than the supply of labor. It is normal for people to be paid based on their level of education. A more productive or skillful worker will earn better than a less productive or skillful worker. Technology is becoming a reason why some people earn more than others. Dangerous working conditions necessitate a higher wage. People who live in areas with high cost of living are often compensated with higher wages. Hours of work. Part-time workers earn less than full-time workers. Sometimes wage differentials are not inevitable. They can be avoided or reduced through government policies. The factors include the bargaining strength of trade unions. Discrimination can be tackled with anti-discriminatory policies. Geographical immobility of labor can also be reduced through policies, such as subsidizing house construction to make housing cheaper. Why wage rate inequalities are justifiable. They can be justified if based on skills or productivity. If they are based on education and training. They encourage hard work, promote entrepreneurship, reduce unemployment, and increase gross domestic product. Why wage rate inequalities are not justifiable. If caused by discrimination, unequal access to education, healthcare, and so on. If they reduce economic growth. Is trade union beneficial? Benefits of trade union to the employee or worker. Higher pay through collective bargaining. Better working conditions. Job security as it prevents unfair dismissal. Training and education. Benefits of trade union to the employer. It increases productivity, reduces cost and raises profit. Better working conditions reduce staff turnover and cost of hiring new workers. Good relationship with unions enhances reputation and industrial peace. Why trade unions are not beneficial to the employee or worker. Loss of jobs, but this depends on the market. It is more likely in perfectly competitive market. The relative strength of the union is also important. The worker has to pay membership fee. Rising wages may cause inflation. It causes inequality as only unionized workers enjoy the higher wage. Why trade unions are not beneficial to the employer. High labor cost. Production stoppage through strikes. Non-friendly relationship with the management. Discussing whether higher wages will benefit the worker or employer. It is also applicable to trade unions and minimum wage because they produce higher wages. Merits and demerits of higher wages. The merits include higher productivity, which is beneficial to the business. Better living standards for the employee. Equitable income distribution. Encourage people to get jobs. The demerits are higher cost to businesses. Higher prices. Loss of jobs. The ideal market. Discussing how an ideal market situation determines wages. The ideal market situation is perfectly competitive market which determines wages through demand and supply. It is unrealistic because of its features or assumptions. The realistic market is the imperfect market which accommodates monopsony, trade union, government intervention through minimum wage, and discrimination. Economic rent, transfer earnings and elasticity of supply of labor. The more inelastic the supply of labor, the higher the economic rent. If labor supply is relatively elastic, transfer earnings exceed economic rent. If labor supply is relatively inelastic, economic rent exceeds transfer earnings. If labor supply is perfectly elastic, all earnings are transfer earnings. If labor supply is perfectly inelastic, all earnings are economic rent. Maximum wage. Should maximum wage be paid to top executives, considering the pay gap between what they earn and what the average worker earns? A maximum wage is the highest wage that can be paid to a worker. It is below the equilibrium wage rate. It creates a black market because of the shortage. Why there should be no maximum wage for top executives. They are limited in supply because of their rare skills. High wages motivate top executives. Some firms may offer higher wages to attract them, creating a black market. It is difficult to establish the appropriate level. Shortage leads to emigration, especially for those who are geographically mobile. Why there should be a maximum wage for top executives. A huge pay gap causes resentment in an organization, which makes it difficult to retain staff. Top managers require more than money to continue to be motivated, that is, non-financial factors. High pay doesn't translate into higher performance. It motivates executives to increase the pay of the low-paid workers if linked to the pay of other workers.